Okay, so again, I'm Bryan, and I'm glad to be here. And let's talk about novels for the next 30 minutes or so. There's my website, and I will share these slides. So you some of the links. Some of the links we won't have time to get into, but you can look at later on your own. Basically, we understand that reading is essential, but reading can be a challenge, especially when reading novels. And so we want to try to find ways to provide novels that our students want to read, increase comprehension, and then create a classroom culture where reading is accepted and enjoyed. Before we get into it, we have to, Vosace is built largely on reading because we understand the value of input that comes from reading text. Again, here's a link you can look at from Dr. Krashen about the science of why reading is so effective. But if you've used reading in your classes, you know from experience that it works, that it makes our students better at the languages. And we don't adequately promote reading until we really believe in it. And this is one thing I've come back to over the last few years. When you're, maybe if you're new to CI type teaching or new to Vosace or new to emphasizing reading, you have to look at this. If reading does not make our students better, we might need to examine our definition of better. And a lot of that comes back to assessment. If we're going to assess students only on their knowledge of linguistics or grammar, then reading may not help them. But we need to examine what we mean when we say our students are getting better. If we're going to assess their holistic abilities and skills and processing and then production, then reading does make them better. Again, I'm going to skip through this kind of quickly. Promoting reading requires a shift in goals and expectation. That's kind of what I was just talking about. Our goal is not knowledge in grammar. Now, reading does actually improve knowledge of grammar, but that's not our main goal. Our main goal is proficiency, processing ability, and actually cultural awareness. But reading helps our students process faster and become more proficient. And it works best in a classroom where that's the goal of everything. If everything we do is trying to gain proficiency, trying to increase processing speed, trying to increase abilities instead of knowledge, reading fits perfectly. It works best in a healthy classroom culture. And when students understand all that and buy into it. Now, classroom culture is something we talk a lot about. Later tomorrow, I have a session about this book that just came out that's a teacher guide, and there's a lot of it that is about classroom culture. One of the things with classroom culture and reading is understanding that everything has a purpose. When students understand that everything they do in class has a purpose, then they realize that reading makes them better. Even if there's not an assessment directly attached to that reading, they understand it makes them better, and it fits into class. So there's a link here that you can look at for a reflection sheet that I use to make sure students know that everything we do, especially reading, has a purpose in class. When we consider reading novels, or any text really, and if you've seen me talk about reading before, I've said this 100 times, but I really come back to it all the time in my classes. There are 3 keys to being successful with reading: compelling texts, interesting texts, comprehensible texts, and in varied delivery. So something that students want to read, something that students can read, and then not doing it the same way all the time. And we'll get into, because when we look at novels, they're not going to be 100% compelling or 100% comprehensible. So we as the teacher need to use some strategies to increase the interest and the comprehensibility. Compelling texts are important. We just don't have time for boring texts. If we read texts that are boring, students don't make an effort to comprehend, and then it's a complete waste of time. If it's not interesting and they don't understand, it's just wasting time. Students disengage even further from reading anything if they're reading boring text, and then they don't take our classes. If we're going to spend a long time reading things that they don't want to read, they won't take our classes. Now, what I get from a lot of teachers is they say, my students hate reading. Unfortunately, I have some students like that as well. Some do like reading, some enjoy it. Some of them hate it in any language, which is sad. And so the question I get is, how do I hold them accountable and verify that they are actually reading? And what I think a better question is, how do I make my students want to read? And the answer is compelling text. the best that we can, we provide students with text that they want to read. And with novels in our languages, we're getting more and more and more novels. There are more and more and more options, which is awesome. So there's a lot of material out there. Depending on your language, there may be more or less, but a lot of novels out there that we can use to try to pique the interest of our students. One concept that's helped me a lot over the last few years is to remember this. I may have students who do not like reading. I don't have to change their minds and make them love reading. I just have to make them want to read this text. So if we're reading a novel in class, I have to make them really want to know what happens next. I have to make them really interested in this novel. Compelling text can be funny, relevant, have unexpected details, debate. Some of these, this is one of my novels here, Sobrevivientes. Definitely not funny, but there's a lot of debate in it. And when we can say, hey, what would you do in this situation? Students become interested and compelled to read more. How do we know if a text is compelling? We have to spend time previewing the texts that are available, the novels, and then we have to know our students. We have to know what interests our students. This question I get sometimes, and again, we're going pretty quickly here, but sometimes you don't have a choice about your novels because you have a class set of novels or a department has selected a novel and there's not much you can do about it. Sometimes that kind of stinks, but there's sometimes nothing you can do about it. If that happens, keep talking with your leadership and saying, hey, you know what? I believe compelling novels are super important. Can we maybe look for some different ones? Adapt, summarize sections, make sure it's comprehensible. If it's not super compelling, make sure it's super comprehensible so the students are understanding. Connect boring text to interesting activities. We'll look at that in a second. And then if you do have to read a novel or any text and it's not super exciting or interesting, make sure that you also include other texts that are funny, interesting, exciting to rekindle the desire to read among your students. If you have a novel that you're reading, it's not super compelling, some things you can do to make it more exciting. Ask students, what would you do in this situation? Change the story. If there's a really boring chapter of a story, say, hey, let's take this text and let's change it. Use actors. So if you have a chapter of a text that's not super exciting or a few chapters and you take actors and act it out, sometimes that just brings it to life a little bit and makes that part a little more fun. Images, anything you can do to make it more compelling will help. Okay, so now let's talk some step-by-step about what we do with novels, some steps for success. Obviously, it's not going to be the same for every person, every novel, but these are some things that have helped me when using novels. The first one is choose a novel or a story. And I just kind of talked about compelling stories. Read the potential novels or stories that you might want to use. The summer is a great time for that, to take a bunch of novels and read them yourself and see. Read the text with the eyes of your students. After you've taught so long, you know what your students can understand and you know what's interesting to them. So when you're reading a potential novel, you're reading it through their eyes. Select a text that seems mostly compelling and comprehensible. Again, it does not have to be 100% comprehensible or compelling because we can do some things to increase. How do we know if a text is compelling and comprehensible? Again, we preview the text. We know our students. Number 2. Decide when or how to read the text. And this is a question I get a lot. Should we read it all at once? Should we spread it out? And the answer is either way. There are two options, but you need to make a decision before you do it, how you're going to do it. The first one is basically we're going to take a section, or we're going to take some time and we're going to focus on this novel as class. So for the next 2, 3, 4 weeks, this novel is going to be most of what we do in class. The other option is we spread it out. So we're doing other things and we're going to read the novel on Friday, or we're going to read it on Tuesday and Friday. We're going to spread it out between other events throughout the course of a year, a semester, whatever. I tend to do this one where I just focus on the novel, but that's just a personal preference. Either one is fine. You just have to decide how you want to do it. The next thing then is, am I going to prepare students for the entire text, especially like the vocabulary they don't know? Am I going to try to prepare them for that vocabulary before we read, like for the entire text before we start? Or am I going to go chapter by chapter, section by section, and prepare them for each section? I prefer this, preparing as we go, because it's usually a matter of how much they need, how much scaffolding, how much help they need before we start. If you have a very easy book that your students are going to understand pretty well, you may be able to prepare them for the entire text before you start. Again, either way works. It's just a decision you need to make. Number 3, and this is one of the most important things, finding out what students do not yet know. So I know I have this novel I want to read. I think it's going to be interesting to my students, mostly comprehensible. Now I'm going to go through each section and I'm going to look for vocabulary and grammar that my students would not know. And I'm going to make lists and a plan for how to best prepare them to comprehend the text. Basically, what we're doing is we're building a bridge between where my students are and the novel. So if this is my novel and they're not quite here, they're over here, I need to build a bridge between my students and the novel. What I do is I take colored markers and I mark the novel. If you can, if not, you can just write lists. But I look at a novel or a chapter of a novel and I make 4 different marks, 4 different categories of new vocabulary. Now, one thing to remember is you don't have to pre-teach every new word in a novel. In fact, you shouldn't. That's a bad practice because it becomes very cumbersome. Train students to use context and to focus on passages instead of words. So when I look at a text, there are 4 types of unknown vocabulary. Some words are not important. They don't know them. They probably can't figure it out, and it doesn't matter. They can understand the passage if they don't understand that word. Some text or some words can be understood with context. Awesome. That's a skill students need to know how to use context to understand passages. I don't do anything with those. Some are needed for comprehension. So there's a word, students don't know it. They need to know it to understand it. So we're going to define it basically. And then the 4th type of vocabulary is something they wouldn't know, but it's a very valuable term. It's high frequency. I want students to go from this reading experience and continue to use that structure. And so that's my 4th type of vocabulary. So I mark all those types of vocabulary in the novel, in the text. If it's not important, again, I leave it. If it's understood with context, I leave it, but we maybe do some practice. I make sure that students are comprehending the context, using the context clues to comprehend. If it's necessary for comprehension and they wouldn't know it, I define it either in the text, projected on a screen, in notes, whatever. I make sure they have definitions for those words. If they don't know that word after the reading, it's not a big deal. They just needed it to comprehend. And then the final category, words that are high frequency and valuable for future use, those we're going to spend a lot more time on. Define, internalize, practice, play games with, assess, use it before and after. We want them to internalize that vocabulary so they understand it in the text and then they continue to use it after. Often this is a question of quantity. Like you can only internalize so many words. So I'm going to take the most powerful ones from any section and make sure students have internalized them. And remember, there's a difference, and get students to understand there's a difference between recognizing and internalizing. These ones that we're doing, that we're defining for comprehension, students will recognize, that's fine. The ones that we're internalizing, they need to have and be able to use. I have a couple examples here. These are novels. I don't know if it's going to open this way. Yeah. Okay. So this novel, Bella Durmiente. It's also available digitally in Voces. It's in Spanish, just to show you an example. So if I am going to read this book with my students and I'm going to read this chapter and I'm going through and I'm reading it and I come to this word casco, helmet. That's a word they wouldn't know, not super important. So maybe I would define it, make sure they know that. I come to this word here, desgastada. Her clothing, like her face, is old, used, and worn out. My students wouldn't probably know desgastada, but I wouldn't spend time defining it because of the context. It's old and used, and they would probably figure out that that means something like old and used and worn out. Hay agujeros en sus pantalones. There are holes in her pants. Agujeros is a word they may not know. They may not know that word for holes, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time defining it because they can figure it out with the context. Now, even if they get it wrong, even if they think that that word means mud, there's mud on her pants, that's fine. I can't spend a lot of time on that because I want them to read the passage and understand the passage. Maybe I come to this word manchado, stained, and that's a word that's going to appear a lot in the book, or that's a word that I think is really important. I want them to know. So maybe we'll spend more time on that. Let me switch and show you a different example here. Let me move this actually, sorry. And show you an example from, there we go, a level 1 story. So here, this story, this book, Perdidos en la Traducción, Lost in Translation, a lower level. So my students are reading this story. Maybe they come to a word like, well, okay, so let's say they come to a word like grita. They don't know the word grita. Maybe that's not super important. So I would maybe define that, make sure they know it so they can understand the story. But then they come to a term like tiene miedo, is afraid. And that's a super valuable word that I want students to be able to use after, because that's a high frequency term that you use in language all the time. So maybe before we read, we're going to spend a lot of time with this phrase, tiene miedo, and practice it and internalize it before we read it. So that's a quick example of how we look for vocabulary and what we do with the different kinds of vocabulary. So after that, this is kind of what we've been doing, but you make the unknown known. So when I find out those words that I need to know, and I want my students to know, then we spend some time internalizing, practicing, using them in other stories, having that vocabulary internalized. So next, after that, is pre-reading. And this is more of making it compelling. We preview the text before we read. Now, we don't have to do this all the time, but often we look at parts of the text or an introduction to the text because we want to spark interest. We want to give multiple repetitions of seeing the language. So here's an example. I think this is in English. Yes, it's in English. This is another novel. This is translated English, but this is chapter 14. This is not all of chapter 14. It's a section of chapter 14. And so as a class, we might read this before we read the entire chapter. Arturo and Clara were running hand in hand, leading the procession of frightened tourists and angry bulls. Because all roads were blocked, their only option was to enter the Plaza de Navarra. The first floor of the building was filled with smoke and chaos. Some people were yelling fire, while others yelled bulls. Arturo grabbed the rocket and was headed for the exit when Clara let go of his hand. He was searching for her in the dark with Camilo yelling in his earpiece, Arturo, get out of there and leave her. Arturo was reaching for her when boom. Okay, so that would be an intro to that chapter. Doesn't give away what happened. It makes us interested to know what's going to happen. What is this boom all about? Another way we can do this, and this is actually from a story, not a novel, but imagine this is a chapter of a novel about Hurricane Maria. We watch videos for what Hurricane Maria was like, and then we do this kind of introduction. There was a woman, her name was Natalia. She lived in Puerto Rico. She was pregnant. Hurricane Maria was going to hit Puerto Rico. A lot of people evacuated. She couldn't evacuate because she was pregnant. She said, I wish we could escape this, to the baby in her stomach. Enrique, her boyfriend, said, whatever happens, I'm with you. He did not leave Puerto Rico. The hurricane arrived. There was a lot of wind. The streets flooded. Natalia and Enrique were in their apartment. The baby wanted to be born. It was going to be born in a hurricane. So again, that is a preview of that chapter of a novel or that text or that story. Doesn't spoil what happens. It does two things. It sparks interest. Now students want to read. So again, I haven't maybe converted them into loving reading, but I have made them want to read this text. It sparks their interest, makes them want to read, and it gives them exposure to some of these phrases and some of this vocabulary that's going to be used in the story. So now when they read the actual story, they understand it better. They're not intimidated by the language, and they want to know what's going to happen. What's going to happen with this lady who's having a baby in a hurricane? Another option is embedded readings. This is what I'm going to leave for you to look at later on if you want. I think a lot of us know what embedded readings are. It's very similar to what I just showed you. It's basically taking a chapter of a novel or a text, breaking it down to the most simple form, starting with that, making sure we can comprehend that, and then adding and adding and adding until you get to the actual chapter of the book. A great way to preview and prepare students for reading. So after that preparation, we get to the actual reading of the text, which is really the easy part. And this is where variation comes in. We read together sometimes, we read individually, we read in groups, we read on the screen, we read the text, we do all kinds of different things when we read. We reenact, sometimes we translate, we use actors, we draw, we ask comprehension questions during the reading. I get questions sometimes about like, how should I read? Should we read together? All these, you should do all those things. And there's another link here you can look at later on about just that. Varying our delivery of reading to avoid fatigue and increase engagement. We should read with a variation of techniques. Another thing that I've used often for reading is screencasts, where I will make a video of the text on a screen or images, me reading it, somebody else reading it, and students can read that in class, out of class. It just alters and changes the way we read. If you have questions about screencasts, let me know. I can help you. I've done a lot of those over the years. It's becoming more common and more popular. After that, then the final part is assessment, which assessment is a gigantic topic. And again, use variation. You can do all kinds of things to assess how well your students have understood and what it's done for them. I use comprehension questions. I use blind quizzes sometimes where they can't use the text in front of them. And one thing I come back to with all of assessment, especially reading, if we go back to that first idea that everything has a purpose, we believe that reading increases proficiency, then we can actually assess reading by assessing writing and speaking. Because if reading makes you better, anything you write, anything you speak is going to prove that you're better, and you've gotten better by your reading, also by your listening in class. Yeah, so there's again some links here, Google Forms. Again, when you're assessing, you can assess anyway and use different ways. I use sometimes English questions, sometimes Spanish questions. I use a lot more multiple choice questions now because I'm an AP teacher and AP uses multiple choice. And there's this question bank here that Gary DiBianca shared with me that has questions that are used in the similar style or form that AP uses, and you can adapt those for anything that you read. Writing and speaking based on reading, I love offering options, various options for when students are going to write or speak after reading. Change the ending, what happens next, change the point of view, write an interview, cause and effect. So these are all the causes that happened in that chapter. What was the effect? These are the effects. What caused those? Sometimes when we do writing or speaking, I have a prompt that is very creative, like maybe changing the ending. I have another prompt that is very much like analyzing, because some students like to be creative and some would rather just analyze what they wrote or read. Yeah. Finally, novels are not the only source of reading. We are constantly reading jokes, songs, trivia, questions, assignments. We are reading all the time. Novels are just another way that we read. Free voluntary reading, I'm not going to get into a lot right now. There's a link here for some resources to help with that. Most of what we looked at today was class reading a novel. Free voluntary reading or silent sustained reading is another great way to use novels. There's a lot of information on there. And again, some resources here to help you with that. My website is there. There are novels in Spanish available there. You can also contact me